My name is Dr. Cornelius Vance. I'm a Beverly Hills dentist who survived the first 3 days of the zombie outbreak. When the government's flu vaccine turned people into flesh-eating monsters, my steady hands and medical training became the difference between life and death. This is my story of survival when precision mattered more than anything. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Cornelius Vance, and I need to tell you exactly what happened during those first 72 hours when everything we knew about the world ended. I was a cosmetic dentist in Beverly Hills, the kind of guy who spent his days giving wealthy clients perfect smiles and charging them premium prices for it. My practice was located on Rodeo Drive, surrounded by luxury boutiques and overpriced cafes where celebrities would grab their morning lattes. I had built what most people would consider the perfect life. My waiting room had Italian leather chairs, my equipment was state-of-the-art German engineering, and my appointment book was filled 3 months in advance with Hollywood executives, real estate moguls and trust fund kids who wanted their teeth to look like polished pearls. I was obsessed with precision. 22 years of dental school and practice had trained my hands to work with millimeter accuracy. Every procedure I performed was executed with surgical precision because in my line of work, one small mistake could ruin someone's entire smile. My colleagues used to joke that I was more machine than man when it came to dental work. My hands never shook, never hesitated, never made errors. This obsession with perfection extended to every aspect of my life. My Beverly Hills mansion was immaculate. My car was always spotless, and my emergency dental kit was organized with military precision. That leather medical bag contained everything I might need for any dental emergency. Local anesthetics, antibiotics, surgical instruments, pain medications, and even some controlled substances that required special permits to obtain. The government's flu vaccine campaign had been the most ambitious public health initiative in American history. They called it Project Immunity, and every news channel, every social media platform, every billboard in the city promoted it as the vaccine to end all flu seasons. The marketing was brilliant and relentless. Celebrities endorsed it, politicians got their shots on live television, and medical professionals across the country praised it as a revolutionary breakthrough. The vaccine was supposed to provide lifetime immunity against all known flu strains, including the ones that killed millions during the 1918 pandemic. Scientists claimed they had cracked the code on universal flu protection, and the entire country bought into the promise. I remember getting my injection at the Walgreens down the street from my office on Saturday morning, October 12th. The pharmacist was cheerful, almost giddy about being part of medical history. She told me I was lucky to be among the first wave of recipients that my dental practice qualified me as an essential healthcare worker. The injection site felt sore for about a day, and I experienced some mild fatigue, but nothing that seemed unusual for a vaccine. By Monday, I felt completely normal again. What I didn't know was that everyone who received that injection was carrying something inside them, something that would activate exactly 72 hours after the needle entered their arm. October 15th started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at my office at 7:30 in the morning, reviewed my appointment schedule, and prepared for what I expected to be a routine day of cleanings, fillings, and consultations. My first patient was Mrs. Catherine Fitzgerald, a 60-year-old socialite who came in every 6 months for maintenance on her porcelain veneers. She was followed by Mr. James Hendricks, a successful real estate developer who needed a simple cleaning and examination. Then I had Mrs. Eleanor Patterson scheduled for a root canal at 2:30, followed by 3 more routine appointments before the end of the day. Mrs. Fitzgerald's appointment went smoothly. She chatted about her upcoming charity gala while I polished her veneers, and she left satisfied with her brilliant white smile. Mr. Hendricks arrived precisely on time for his 1 o'clock appointment. He was a punctual man, always dressed in expensive suits and carrying himself with the confidence that comes from years of successful business dealings. His cleaning took about 45 minutes, and he scheduled his next appointment for 6 months out before shaking my hand and leaving through the front door. I remember thinking how normal everything felt, how perfectly ordinary that Tuesday afternoon seemed. Mrs. Patterson arrived early for her root canal, which, didn't surprise me because she was notorious for her punctuality. She had been dreading this procedure for weeks, calling my office multiple times to ask about pain management and recovery time. I assured her that modern root canal procedures were far less traumatic than most people believed, and that my precision techniques would minimize any discomfort. She settled into the dental chair at 2:25, and I began preparing my instruments for what should have been a straightforward endodontic procedure. The local anesthetic took effect quickly, and I began the careful process of drilling into her infected tooth. My hands moved with their usual precision, each movement calculated and controlled. I had performed thousands of root canals during my career, and this one seemed identical to all the others. Mrs. Patterson was relaxed, her eyes closed, trusting completely in my expertise. The drill hummed steadily as I worked, and everything proceeded exactly according to plan. That's when I heard the first scream from my waiting room. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard in my dental practice. It wasn't the usual anxiety-induced yelp that sometimes came from nervous patients. This was a scream of pure terror, the kind of sound that makes your blood turn cold and your hands freeze in place. I looked down at Mrs. Patterson, whose eyes had snapped open in alarm. She tried to speak, but the anesthetic made it impossible for her to form words clearly. I could see the fear in her eyes as we both listened to the chaos erupting in the next room. More screams followed, along with sounds I couldn't immediately identify. There was crashing, like furniture being overturned, and a strange growling, noise that didn't sound human. I set down my drill and moved toward the treatment room door, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe someone had collapsed, or perhaps there was a medical emergency in the waiting room. My receptionist, Sandra, was trained in basic first aid, but she might need my help if someone was having a heart attack or stroke. I opened the door between my treatment room and the waiting area, and what I saw changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Mr. Hendricks was standing in the middle of my waiting room, but he wasn't the same well-dressed businessman who had left my office just 20 minutes earlier. His expensive suit was torn and stained with something dark and wet. His perfectly groomed hair was disheveled, and his face had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look like he hadn't slept in days. But it was his eyes that made me take a step backward. They had turned completely black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, as if someone had filled them with ink. Mrs. Patterson was pressed against my reception desk, her back to the wall, and her hands raised defensively in front of her face. Her purse was scattered on the floor, its contents spilled across the Italian marble tiles I had installed just 6 months earlier. She was trying to scream again, but terror had reduced her voice to a hoarse whisper. Between her and the exit door stood Mr. Hendricks, moving with jerky, unnatural movements that reminded me of a predator stalking its prey. The growling sound I had heard was coming from him. It was low and constant, like the rumble of an angry dog, but it was definitely coming from a human throat. When he opened his mouth, I could see that his teeth were stained with the same dark substance that covered his clothing. His lips were pulled back in a snarl that revealed not just his teeth, but his gums, which had turned a sickly purple color. I called out to them, asking what was wrong, but Mr. Hendricks didn't respond to my voice. He didn't even seem to notice I was there. His entire focus was on Mrs. Patterson, and he was moving toward her with that same predatory gait. She pressed herself harder against the desk, whimpering softly, but there was nowhere for her to go. The exit door was blocked by Mr. Hendricks, and the only other way out was through my treatment room. That's when he lunged forward with impossible speed. I had always thought of Mr. Hendricks as a typical middle-aged businessman, probably out of shape from too many client dinners and too little exercise. But the thing that attacked Mrs. Patterson moved like a trained athlete. He covered the distance between them in a single leap, his hands reaching for her throat with fingers that seemed longer and more claw-like than I remembered. Mrs. Patterson's scream was cut short as he grabbed her, and they both crashed to the floor behind my reception desk. I ran toward them, shouting for him to stop, but by the time I reached the desk, it was already too late. Mr. Hendricks was crouched over Mrs. Patterson, and the sounds coming from behind that desk were unlike anything I had ever heard. There was tearing, wet and horrible, mixed with Mrs. Patterson's gurgling attempts to breathe. The smell hit me then, metallic and sickening, and I realized I was looking at something that shouldn't be possible. He was feeding on her. Actually feeding, like a wild animal that had brought down its prey. I could see her legs twitching, could hear her trying to make sounds, but Mr. Hendricks was completely absorbed in what he was doing. The back of his head bobbed up and down as he worked, and I could hear him making satisfied grunting noises between the terrible sounds of tearing flesh. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. This was my dental office, my safe space, my perfectly controlled environment where the worst thing that usually happened was someone fainting during a procedure. But now there was blood on my Italian marble floor, spreading in a growing pool that reflected the overhead lights. The metallic smell was getting stronger, and I could taste it in the back of my throat. I grabbed the first thing I could find, which was a heavy glass paperweight from my reception desk. I raised it above my head, ready to strike Mr. Hendricks, but something made me hesitate. This was still Mr. Hendricks, wasn't it? The man who had been in my chair just minutes earlier, talking about his daughter's wedding plans and his upcoming vacation to Hawaii. How could I attack him, even if he was clearly having some kind of psychotic break? That hesitation almost cost me my life. Mr. Hendricks suddenly looked up from his feeding, and those black eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that was both human and completely alien. His face was covered in blood, and pieces of Mrs. Patterson were still hanging from his teeth. But in that moment I realized he was evaluating me as his next meal. The look in those black eyes was pure hunger, and I understood that whatever was left of the man I had known was gone. He started to rise from his crouch, moving with that same unnatural speed, and I knew I had maybe 2 seconds before he would be on me. I brought the paperweight down as hard as I could, aiming for his skull, but he moved at the last second and I only caught him on the shoulder. The impact was solid enough to knock him sideways, but it didn't stop him. He rolled with the blow and came up snarling, those black eyes locked on mine. I ran. There was no shame in admitting it now, because running was the only rational response to what I had just witnessed. I sprinted back through my treatment room, where Mrs. Patterson was still lying in the dental chair with her mouth propped open, completely unaware of what had just happened to her namesake in the waiting room. I grabbed my emergency dental kit from the supply closet, a leather bag that contained everything I might need for urgent procedures outside the office. 20 years of dental practice had taught me to always be prepared for emergencies, and something told me this qualified. The back exit of my office led to a service alley that connected to the main street. I had used this entrance thousands of times during my career, but never while running for my life. As I pushed through the heavy steel door, I could hear Mr. Hendricks behind me making those same growling sounds, but closer now. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The alley was empty, which seemed wrong somehow. It was 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon in Beverly Hills, and there should have been people everywhere. Shoppers, tourists, business people heading to meetings, all the usual crowd that made this area one of the busiest in Los Angeles. But the alley was silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the distant noise of what sounded like car alarms and sirens. I reached the mouth of the alley and stopped, pressing myself against the brick wall to catch my breath and assess the situation. What I saw when I looked out onto Rodeo Drive made me question my own sanity. The street was chaos. Cars were stopped, at odd angles, some with their doors hanging open and their engines still running. There were people in the street, but they weren't behaving like people. They moved with that same jerky, predatory gait I had seen from Mr. Hendricks, and they were chasing other people who ran screaming between the abandoned vehicles. I watched a woman in a business suit tackle a teenager near the fountain in the center of the shopping district. She brought him down with the same impossible speed Mr. Hendricks had shown, and within seconds she was feeding on him while he screamed and tried to fight her off. A man in the expensive jogging outfit was pursuing an elderly couple toward the Gucci store, moving faster than any human should be able to run. When he caught the old man, the same horrific scene played out again. The smell of smoke was starting to drift through the air, and I could see flames coming from the windows of at least 3 buildings along the street. Emergency sirens were wailing from multiple directions, but I couldn't see any police cars or ambulances actually responding to the chaos. It was as if the entire city's emergency response system had simply collapsed in the space of a few hours. I needed to get home. My house was in the hills above Beverly Hills, a gated community with excellent security systems and neighbors who valued their privacy. If I could reach my car in the parking garage beneath my office building, I might be able to navigate through the chaos and reach the relative safety of my neighborhood. The alternative was staying in the city center, where it was becoming increasingly clear that nowhere was safe. But first, I needed to understand what was happening. The rational part of my mind was still trying to process the events of the last 30 minutes, searching for logical explanations for the impossible things I had witnessed. Maybe there had been a gas leak that caused mass hallucinations. Maybe this was some kind of terrorist attack using mind-altering chemicals. Maybe I was having a nervous breakdown and none of this was actually happening. Then I saw Sandra, my receptionist, stumbling out of the front entrance of my office building. She was holding her throat with both hands and blood was seeping between her fingers. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was looking around frantically as if searching for help. I started to move toward her to offer assistance, but something about her movement made me stop. She had been bitten. The wounds on her neck were clearly bite marks, and as I watched, her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the sidewalk. For a moment she lay still, and I thought she might be dead. But then her body began to convulse, not like a seizure, but like something was fighting to get out from inside her. The convulsions lasted for maybe 30 seconds, and then she went completely still. When Sandra stood up again, her eyes had turned black. That was the moment I realized the truth. Whatever was happening to people wasn't a gas leak or a terrorist attack. It was something that spread through bites, something that turned normal human beings into those feeding creatures in a matter of minutes. And everyone who had received the government's flu vaccine was potentially susceptible to this transformation. I thought about the 72 hours that had passed since my injection. I thought about how everyone I knew had gotten the same vaccine at approximately the same time. I thought about the coordinated timing of this outbreak, how it seemed to be happening everywhere at once, and I understood that this wasn't a random event. This was planned. This was intentional. The vaccine hadn't protected us from disease. It had made us vulnerable to something much worse. I made my way to the parking garage, staying close to the walls and avoiding the main streets where the chaos was most intense. My car was a silver BMW sedan, practical and reliable, with a full tank of gas and an excellent navigation system. As I approached the vehicle, I could hear footsteps echoing through the concrete structure, but I couldn't tell if they belonged to normal people or the infected ones. I unlocked the car as quietly as possible and slipped into the driver's seat, placing my dental kit on the passenger seat beside me. The leather bag felt heavier than usual, and I realized it was because it might contain the only medical supplies I would have access to for the foreseeable future. Those anesthetics, antibiotics, and surgical instruments that I had always considered routine tools of my trade might become the difference between life and death in this new world. The drive home normally took about 20 minutes, but today, it took almost 2 hours. I had to take detours around accidents, burning buildings, and streets that were completely blocked by abandoned vehicles. Several times I had to reverse course when I encountered groups of the infected, and twice I had to drive through areas where normal people were fighting desperately against the creatures that had once been their neighbors and friends. By the time I reached my gated community, the sun was setting and the true scope of the disaster was becoming clear. Emergency broadcasts were playing on every radio station, but the information was contradictory and increasingly desperate. Some reports claimed it was a terrorist attack, others suggested a new form of rabies, and a few mentioned the possibility of biological warfare. None of them mentioned the vaccine, but I was beginning to suspect that information was being deliberately suppressed. My house sat on 2 acres of manicured lawn, surrounded by a 10-foot wall topped with security cameras and motion sensors. The building itself was a modern fortress with reinforced windows, steel doors, and a security system that would make most government facilities envious. I had always thought these precautions were excessive, installed mainly to satisfy my insurance company and impress visitors. Now they might be the only thing keeping me alive. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that my neighbor's house was dark and their car was gone. The Hendersons lived in the house to my left, and they had 3 young children who usually made enough noise to wake the dead. The unusual quiet from their property was disturbing, but I couldn't afford to investigate. I needed to secure my own home and figure out what to do next. I parked in my garage and activated the security system, watching the heavy steel door roll down behind me. For the first time in hours, I felt relatively safe. My house was designed to keep intruders out, and it should be equally effective at keeping the infected away from me. I had enough food and water to last for several weeks, and my dental supplies might be useful for treating injuries if I encountered other survivors. But as I stood in my kitchen, looking out at the city lights flickering in the distance, I realized that my biggest challenge wasn't going to be the infected creatures roaming the streets. It was going to be the knowledge that everyone I cared about had received the same vaccine I had, and that any of them could transform into one of those things at any moment. The scratching sound at my front door started just after 10 o'clock that evening, and I knew that my period of safety was about to end. The scratching at my front door wasn't random or accidental. It had a deliberate, methodical quality that made my skin crawl. Each scrape against the reinforced steel was precise and patient, like someone testing the strength of the metal with their fingernails. I crept to my security monitor and switched to the front door camera, expecting to see one or two of the infected creatures I had witnessed in the city. Instead, I counted at least 8 of them gathered on my front porch, all moving with that same coordinated behavior I was beginning to recognize as their hunting pattern. They weren't mindlessly clawing at the door like wild animals. They were systematically examining my security measures, running their hands along the door frame, testing the hinges, even looking up at the security cameras with those black eyes that seemed to register far more intelligence than they should possess. One of them, a woman in what had once been a nurse's uniform, was actually studying the electronic lock system with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. This was wrong. Everything I had read about zombie outbreaks in movies and books suggested that these creatures should be mindless, driven only by hunger and basic instincts. But what I was observing through my security cameras looked more like a coordinated reconnaissance mission. They were learning about my defenses, and that terrified me more than their speed or their feeding behavior had. I spent the next 6 hours moving between my security monitors, watching groups of infected people systematically explore every inch of my property. They tested the walls, examined the gates, and even attempted to climb the security fence that surrounded my backyard. What disturbed me most was their patience. They didn't show frustration when they encountered obstacles. Instead, they would study each barrier carefully, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes before moving on to test a different approach. My house had motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter, and every time the infected triggered them, I got a clear view of their transformed faces. Some I recognized as neighbors from the gated community. Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down was among them, still wearing the designer tracksuit she used for her morning jogs. Mr. Rodriguez, who had helped me install my security system 2 years earlier, was methodically examining the very cameras he had positioned for maximum coverage. The most disturbing discovery came around 3 in the morning when I realized they were communicating with each other. Not through speech, because none of them seemed capable of forming words anymore, but through a series of low growling sounds and physical gestures that clearly conveyed information. When one of them found a potential weakness in my fence, it would make a specific sound that brought the others to investigate. When they determined that a particular approach wouldn't work, they would move away in organized groups rather than wandering off randomly. I tried calling the police, the National Guard, even the CDC emergency hotline, but all I got were busy signals or recorded messages telling me that all circuits were busy. The few radio stations still broadcasting were playing emergency alerts on loop, but the information was hours old and increasingly irrelevant. The government's official response seemed to be complete denial that anything unusual was happening, which told me that either they had no idea how to handle this situation, or they were deliberately covering up their role in creating it. By dawn, I had consumed most of my emergency food supplies and realized that my beautiful fortress was also becoming my prison. The infected hadn't left during the night. If anything, their numbers had grown. I counted at least 15 of them now, spread around my property in what looked like a coordinated surveillance pattern. They had positioned themselves at strategic points where they could observe every possible exit from my house, and they showed no signs of losing interest or moving on to easier targets. My dental kit sat on the kitchen counter, and I found myself inventorying its contents repeatedly as a way to calm my nerves. Local anesthetics including lidocaine and articaine, broad-spectrum antibiotics like amoxicillin and clindamycin, prescription, pain medications, surgical instruments designed for precision work in confined spaces, and even some emergency sutures that I kept for treating accidental cuts during procedures. In my previous life, these supplies had been routine tools for cosmetic dental work. Now they represented the sum total of my medical resources in a world where hospitals were probably overrun and pharmacies were likely looted. The breakthrough came when the infected finally managed to shatter one of my ground floor windows. It happened around 7 in the morning, just as I was beginning to think they might give up and move on to easier targets. The window that failed was in my home office, a room I rarely used but had equipped with the same reinforced glass as the rest of the house. The sound of breaking glass was followed immediately by the shuffle of feet and that characteristic low growling that meant they were excited about something. I grabbed my dental kit and ran upstairs, activating the security system's panic mode. As I went, steel shutters began descending over all the remaining windows and the house's internal defense systems engaged, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they found another way inside. My mansion had been designed to keep out human intruders, not creatures that seemed to have enhanced strength and unlimited patience. From my upstairs bedroom window, I could see the chaos spreading throughout my neighborhood. Several houses were burning, sending thick columns of black smoke into the morning sky. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the street, some with their doors hanging open as if their occupants had fled in panic. In the distance, I could hear sporadic gunfire and what sounded like explosions, suggesting that someone was mounting organized resistance against the infected. That's when I saw the family trapped in the car. The vehicle was a red Honda Civic, stopped in the middle of the street about 50 yards from my front gate. Through my binoculars, I could see 4 people. Inside, 2 adults in the front seats and what appeared to be 2 children in the back. The car wasn't moving, and I could see at least 6 infected creatures surrounding it, testing the doors and windows with that same methodical patience they had shown with my house. The driver was a man in his 30s, probably a mechanic based on the work clothes he was wearing. He was frantically trying to restart the engine while the woman beside him held what looked like an infant in her arms. In the back seat, I could see an older child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, pressed against the window and clearly terrified. The infected were beginning to coordinate their assault on the vehicle, with some of them working on the doors while others examined the windows for weak points. I faced a choice that would define everything that happened next. I could stay safe in my fortified house and watch this family die, or I could risk my own life to help people I had never met. Every rational calculation suggested that I should stay put. My house was secure, I had supplies, and there was no guarantee that I could save them even if I tried. But watching that little girl's face pressed against the car window reminded me of something I had almost forgotten during my years of treating wealthy clients and building my perfect life. I became a dentist because I wanted to help people. That motivation had gotten buried under years of cosmetic procedures and elective treatments, but it was still there, buried beneath the surface of my carefully constructed professional identity. My garage contained more than just my BMW. I had a collection of tools and equipment that reflected my obsessive need to be prepared for any situation. Emergency medical supplies, tactical flashlights, even some basic camping gear that I had. Never actually used but kept because it made me feel more self-reliant. Most importantly, I had several containers of emergency supplies including more medical equipment than what fit in my portable dental kit. The plan I developed was insane, but it was the only chance that family had. I would use my car to ram through the infected surrounding their vehicle, then guide them back to my house where we could establish a more secure position. It wasn't a good plan, but it was better than letting them die while I watched from my bedroom window. I loaded my BMW with everything I thought we might need: extra medical supplies, bottles of water, some of my remaining food, and most importantly, several vials of lidocaine that could be used to keep an injured person quiet during emergency treatment. I had no idea if we would encounter injuries during the rescue, but I knew that noise could attract more infected, and my anesthetics might be the difference between life and death for someone who was hurt. The garage door opener seemed unusually loud as I prepared to leave my safe haven. I could see infected creatures on my security monitors beginning to converge on the garage, drawn by the mechanical sounds. This meant I would have maybe 30 seconds to reach the family's car before my escape route was completely blocked. I backed out of the garage at high speed, scattering several infected who had positioned themselves behind my car. The impact with the first one was sickeningly solid, but I couldn't afford to stop or hesitate. I accelerated toward the red Honda, horn blaring to get the family's attention, and slammed my BMW into the group of infected surrounding their vehicle. The collision was more violent than I had expected. My car's front end crumpled against the bodies of 3 infected, but the engine kept running and the doors still opened. I shouted for the family to get out of their car and into mine, but they seemed frozen with terror. The man behind the wheel was staring at me with disbelief, as if he couldn't process that someone was actually trying to help them. The woman holding the infant moved first. She opened her door and ran toward my car, clutching the baby protectively against her chest. I could see now that it was a boy, maybe 6 months old, and he was crying with the kind of desperate wail that babies make when they sense their parents' panic. The older child, a girl with long brown hair, followed her mother but kept looking back at the man who was still sitting in the driver's seat of the Honda. That's when I realized he was injured. Blood was seeping through his work shirt, and his left arm was hanging at an unnatural angle. He had been bitten, probably during an earlier encounter with the infected, and he was too weak to move quickly. The girl was trying to help him out of the car, but she was too small and he was too heavy for her to support. I ran to help them, leaving my engine running and my doors open. The man's name was Mark Henderson, and his injuries were worse than they had appeared from a distance. The bite on his left shoulder was deep and infected, and he had clearly lost a significant amount of blood. His wife Lisa was an elementary school teacher, and their children were Emma, age 8, and baby Jake. They had been trying to reach Lisa's parents in Pasadena when their car broke down in my neighborhood. Getting Mark into my car required both Lisa and me supporting his weight, and I could tell that the effort was causing him significant pain. Emma climbed into the back seat on her own, still clutching a small stuffed animal that she had somehow managed to hold on to throughout their ordeal. Baby Jake had stopped crying, but he seemed listless in a way that worried me. I had enough medical training to recognize the signs of dehydration and stress in an infant. The drive back to my garage took less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. More infected were emerging from the surrounding houses, drawn by the noise of our escape and the smell of Mark's blood. I could see them in my rearview mirror, running with that impossible speed toward my property. We reached my garage just as the first of them arrived at my gate, and I managed to get the security door closed with maybe 10 seconds to spare. Inside my house, I immediately set up a makeshift medical station in my living room. Mark's bite wound needed immediate attention, and I was the closest thing to a doctor that any of us were likely to see. My dental training included enough general medical knowledge to handle basic trauma care, and my surgical instruments were designed for precision work in difficult conditions. Lisa helped me get Mark onto my leather couch while I prepared my supplies. The bite wound was infected, probably from bacteria in the attacker's mouth, and it would need to be cleaned and treated with antibiotics if Mark was going to have any chance of avoiding sepsis. I had enough amoxicillin in my dental kit to provide a full course of treatment, but I would need to be careful with the dosage since I was working outside my area of expertise. Emma sat quietly in the corner, watching everything with the kind of serious attention that children develop when they realize their world has become dangerous. She hadn't said much since they got into my car, but I could tell she was processing everything that was happening around her. When I asked her if she was hurt, she shook her head but then mentioned that her tooth had been bothering her for several days. This seemed like a minor concern given everything else we were dealing with, but something about the way she described the pain made me take a closer look. Her left cheek was slightly swollen, and when I examined her mouth with a dental mirror, I could see that one of her molars was badly infected. The abscess was putting pressure on her facial nerves, and if left untreated, the infection could spread to her bloodstream or even her brain. In the normal world, this would have been a routine emergency that could be handled with a simple extraction and a course of antibiotics. But in our current situation, Emma's infected tooth represented a potentially life-threatening medical crisis. I had the tools and knowledge necessary to treat her, but performing oral surgery on a child, while her father recovered from infected bite wounds and her mother tried to care for an infant, was not exactly an ideal situation. Lisa was remarkably calm considering the circumstances. She had taken charge of caring for baby Jake, and she was helping me monitor Mark's condition while I prepared to treat Emma's dental emergency. Her background as a teacher had given her experience staying calm under pressure and organizing chaotic situations, skills that were proving invaluable in our current crisis. As I prepared my instruments for Emma's procedure, I found myself thinking about how dramatically our situation had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, I had been a cosmetic dentist whose biggest concern was maintaining my appointment schedule and keeping my wealthy clients satisfied. Today I was the primary medical officer for a group of survivors trapped in a house surrounded by infected creatures who seemed to be growing more organized and intelligent with each passing hour. The infected outside my house were no longer just testing my defenses randomly. They had established what appeared to be a systematic surveillance pattern, with different groups taking shifts at key observation points around my property. When I checked my security monitors, I could see them positioning themselves to watch every possible exit, and they were doing it with a level of coordination that suggested they were capable of complex planning and communication. This evolution in their behavior was perhaps the most disturbing development yet. If the infected were capable of learning and adapting their tactics, then traditional defensive strategies would become increasingly ineffective over time. They would eventually find ways to overcome any static defenses, no matter how well designed or heavily fortified. But I couldn't focus on long-term strategic concerns when I had immediate medical emergencies to address. Emma's tooth infection was getting worse by the hour, and Mark's bite wound was showing early signs of systemic infection. Baby Jake needed proper nutrition and medical attention that I wasn't qualified to provide, and Lisa was approaching the limits of her emotional endurance. I administered a local anesthetic to numb Emma's mouth, using the same lidocaine that I had relied on for thousands of dental procedures over the years. She was remarkably brave during the injection, holding her stuffed animal tightly but not crying or struggling. I explained each step of the procedure to her in simple terms, the same way I would talk to any young patient in my normal practice. The extraction itself went smoothly, thanks to years of experience in the precision instruments in my dental kit. Emma's infected tooth came out cleanly, and I was able to clean the socket thoroughly and pack it with antibiotic gauze to prevent further infection. The entire procedure took about 20 minutes, and Emma handled it better than many adult patients I had treated in my regular practice. As I finished treating Emma, I realized that we had reached a turning point in our survival situation. We were no longer just individuals trying to stay alive in an increasingly dangerous world. We had become a group with shared responsibilities and mutual dependencies. Mark's mechanical skills could help us maintain our equipment and possibly repair vehicles. Lisa's teaching experience made her a natural organizer and caregiver. Emma, despite her age, had already proven herself to be resilient and observant. Even baby Jake represented hope for the future, a reminder that life could continue even in the darkest circumstances. But we also faced challenges that none of us were fully prepared to handle. Our food supplies were limited, our medical resources were finite, and the infected outside seemed to be developing increasingly sophisticated hunting strategies. Most critically, we were trapped in a location that provided excellent short-term security but offered no long-term sustainability. The radio reports we managed to receive suggested that the infection was spreading rapidly across the entire country, with major cities falling one by one to coordinated attacks by groups of infected. Government response was fragmented and ineffective, with military units reporting that conventional weapons were less effective against the infected than expected. There were rumors of safe zones being established, but the information was contradictory and the locations kept changing. As night fell on our second day together, I found myself standing at my kitchen window, looking out at the city lights that were slowly going dark across the valley below. The infected creatures surrounding my house had settled into what appeared to be a patient waiting pattern, maintaining their surveillance positions but not actively testing our defenses. It was as if they knew that we would eventually have to leave our sanctuary, and they were prepared to wait as long as necessary for that moment to arrive. Lisa joined me at the window, baby Jake sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time since they had arrived. Mark was resting comfortably on the couch, his fever finally beginning to break thanks to the antibiotics I had administered. Emma was curled up in my reading chair, exhausted from her dental procedure, but no longer in pain. We were alive, we were together, and we had successfully treated the immediate medical crises that had threatened to tear our group apart. But as I watched the infected creatures maintaining their vigilant positions around my property, I knew that our real challenges were just beginning. Tomorrow, we would need to make decisions about our long-term survival that would determine whether we lived through the next week, let alone the months or years that this crisis might continue. The scratching at my front door had stopped, but that didn't mean we were safe. It meant the infected had learned enough about our defenses to plan their next move, and they were patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to execute whatever strategy they were developing. Emma's recovery from the tooth extraction was remarkably quick, which gave me hope that children might be more resilient than adults in this new world we found ourselves navigating. By the morning of our second day together, she was eating solid food again, and even managed to smile when I checked her surgical site. The socket was healing cleanly, with no signs of continued infection, and her facial swelling had reduced significantly overnight. What impressed me most was her attitude. Despite everything she had witnessed and endured, she maintained a curiosity about our situation that reminded me why I had originally been drawn to working with patients. Mark's condition had stabilized as well, though his recovery was progressing more slowly than I would have liked. The antibiotics were controlling the infection in his bite wound, but he was still weak from blood loss and the systemic effects of having fought off the bacterial invasion. His mechanical knowledge was already proving invaluable, though. He had identified several ways we could improve our security systems and had sketched out modifications to my garage that would allow us to work on vehicles while maintaining our defensive position. Lisa had transformed from a panicked mother into our group's unofficial coordinator, organizing our supplies, establishing schedules for monitoring the security cameras, and somehow managing to keep baby Jake fed and content despite our challenging circumstances. Her teaching background had given her skills in managing group dynamics and maintaining morale that were proving essential to our survival. She had also begun asking questions about our long-term plans that I wasn't entirely ready to answer. The infected outside our house had settled into a pattern that was both reassuring and deeply disturbing. They maintained their surveillance positions during daylight hours, but they were no longer actively testing our defenses every few minutes. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something, which suggested a level of strategic thinking that challenged everything I thought I knew about their capabilities. At night, their numbers would increase, and I could observe them through the security cameras engaged in what appeared to be planning sessions, with different groups taking turns, examining our property from various angles. What concerned me most was their apparent ability to learn from their observations. On the first night, they had wasted considerable time and energy testing defenses that were obviously too strong for them to overcome. By the second night, they were focusing their attention on genuinely vulnerable points in our security, and they were doing so with the kind of systematic approach that suggested they were sharing information with each other. I had been monitoring radio communications throughout our time together, hoping to gather intelligence about the scope of the outbreak and the effectiveness of government response efforts. What I learned was deeply troubling. The infection had spread far, beyond Los Angeles, with major population centers across the country reporting similar coordinated attacks by groups of infected individuals. Military responses were proving less effective than expected, with conventional weapons requiring multiple hits to stop infected attackers, and traditional crowd control methods failing completely against opponents who seemed immune to pain and fear. More disturbing were the reports from medical facilities that had attempted to treat infected individuals in the early stages of the outbreak. Several hospitals had been overrun when patients who appeared to be responding to treatment suddenly transformed and attacked medical staff. The transformation seemed to be triggered by stress or injury, which meant that even infected individuals who appeared stable could become dangerous without warning. This information forced me to reevaluate Mark's condition and our group's overall safety. His bite wound was healing well, and he showed no signs of the behavioral changes that preceded transformation, but I had no way to know whether the infection was completely eliminated or simply dormant. The uncertainty was eating at me, because I knew that if Mark transformed while we were trapped together in my house, we would have no escape route and no way to defend ourselves effectively. Lisa had noticed my growing anxiety about Mark's condition, and she finally confronted me about it during one of our evening planning sessions. She was remarkably direct in her questions, asking whether I thought her husband might still be infected, and what our options would be if he showed signs of transformation. Her practical approach to discussing this possibility impressed me, though I could see the fear in her eyes as we talked through the various scenarios. The conversation led to our first serious discussion about long-term survival strategies. My house provided excellent security, but it was designed as a temporary refuge rather than a permanent fortress. Our food supplies would last perhaps 2 more weeks with careful rationing, and we had no renewable sources of water or power. Most critically, we had no way to obtain additional medical supplies when my dental kit was exhausted, and no means of communication with other survivor groups who might be establishing more sustainable communities. Mark's mechanical expertise led him to suggest that we should consider mobility as our primary survival strategy, rather than trying to maintain a fixed defensive position. He had identified several vehicles in our neighborhood that could be modified for better protection and extended range, and he believed that a mobile group would have better opportunities to scavenge supplies and locate other survivors. His argument was compelling, but it would require us to abandon the security of my house and venture into territory controlled by increasingly organized groups of infected. Emma's perspective on our situation was different from the adults, but equally valuable. She had been observing the infected through the security cameras with the kind of focused attention that children bring to puzzles they're trying to solve. Her insights into their behavior patterns were surprisingly sophisticated, and she had noticed details that the rest of us had missed. She pointed out that the infected seemed to have established shift schedules, with different individuals taking turns at observation posts, and she had identified what appeared to be leadership roles within their group. These observations suggested that the infected were not just capable of learning and planning, but that they had developed a social structure that allowed them to coordinate complex activities over extended periods. This was far beyond anything that had been reported in the early media coverage of the outbreak, and it implied that our opponents were evolving rapidly in response to the challenges of their new environment. The implications were staggering. If the infected were capable of organization and strategic thinking, then they would eventually develop tactics that could overcome any fixed defenses. They would learn to coordinate their attacks, to use tools and weapons, and possibly even to set traps for survivors. The idea that we were facing intelligent opponents rather than mindless monsters changed everything about our survival calculations. Our second night together was when we experienced our first real test as a group. Baby Jake developed a fever that spiked rapidly, reaching dangerous levels despite Lisa's best efforts to keep him cool and hydrated. I had limited experience with pediatric medicine, but I knew enough to recognize the signs of severe dehydration and possible bacterial infection. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jake's symptoms could indicate anything from a simple cold to a life-threatening systemic infection. My dental supplies included some medications that could help treat Jake's fever, but the dosages for infants were far outside my area of expertise. I had to make calculations based on adult dosages and hope that my estimates were accurate enough to help without causing additional harm. Lisa assisted me with the treatment, but I could see the terror in her eyes as she watched her baby's condition deteriorate. The crisis lasted through most of the night, with Jake's fever climbing and falling unpredictably while we tried different combinations of medications and cooling techniques. Emma proved remarkably helpful during this emergency, following instructions carefully and providing crucial assistance while her parents focused on Jake's care. Her calm behavior under pressure reminded me that children often adapt to crisis situations more effectively than adults, possibly because they haven't yet learned to fear all the things that could go wrong. By dawn, Jake's fever had broken and he was showing signs of improvement. But the experience had demonstrated how vulnerable we were to medical emergencies that would have been routine in the normal world. We had exhausted a significant portion of my medical supplies treating one sick infant, and we had no way to replenish those resources without venturing into dangerous territory controlled by the infected. The medical crisis also revealed something important about our group dynamics. Under extreme stress, we had functioned effectively as a team, with each person contributing their strengths to address the emergency. Mark's mechanical skills weren't directly relevant to treating a sick baby, but he had maintained our security systems and monitored our perimeter, while the rest of us focused on medical care. Lisa's teaching experience had helped her stay calm and organized during the crisis. Emma's maturity and willingness to help had been essential to our success. Most importantly, we had all demonstrated a commitment to the group that went beyond individual survival. We had risked our limited medical resources to save Jake, even though his death would have reduced our logistical burden and improved our chances of long-term survival. This willingness to sacrifice for each other was essential to our functioning as a group, but it also made us vulnerable to the kind of emotional manipulation that could lead to poor strategic decisions. The morning after Jake's medical crisis brought our first serious discussion about leaving my house. Our supplies were diminishing faster than I had anticipated, and the infected outside seemed to be increasing their numbers and improving their coordination. Most concerning, we had observed several infected individuals who appeared to be conducting reconnaissance missions, moving systematically through the neighborhood and examining other properties with the same methodical attention they had shown to our defenses. Mark had been monitoring radio communications and had picked up fragmentary reports of other survivor groups, establishing communities in less populated areas outside the major cities. These groups were apparently having some success in creating sustainable defensive positions, but they were also reporting that the infected were adapting their tactics in response to organized resistance. The infected were learning to avoid direct confrontation with well-armed survivors, instead focusing on disrupting supply lines and isolating survivor communities from each other. This intelligence suggested that our current strategy of maintaining a fixed defensive position was ultimately unsustainable. The infected would eventually develop tactics that could overcome our defenses, and our isolation made us vulnerable to being cut off from other survivor groups who might be developing more effective long-term strategies. We needed to consider whether mobility might offer better prospects for survival, even though it would require us to abandon the security of my house. Lisa was the first to explicitly advocate for leaving, arguing that our children's future depended on finding a larger community where they could grow up with other survivors and develop the skills they would need to thrive in this new world. Her perspective was compelling, but it also forced us to confront the reality that our comfortable refuge was actually a trap that would eventually become our tomb if we didn't have the courage to leave it. Mark's condition had improved enough that he could travel, though he would need to be careful not to reopen his wound or exhaust himself during any extended journey. His mechanical knowledge had allowed him to identify several vehicles in our neighborhood that could be modified for better protection and extended range, and he had already begun planning routes that would take us away from the most heavily infected areas while keeping us within range of potential supply sources. Emma's insights into the infected behavior patterns had revealed something that gave us hope for a successful escape. She had noticed that the infected seemed to have established territorial boundaries with different groups controlling specific areas and rarely venturing outside their designated zones. This suggested that if we could successfully leave the territory controlled by the group surrounding our house, we might encounter different infected groups that wouldn't be familiar with our capabilities and wouldn't have had time to develop specific tactics for dealing with us. The decision to leave was ultimately made for us by circumstances beyond our control. On the morning of our third day together, we observed a significant change in the infected behavior patterns. Instead of maintaining their usual surveillance positions, they were gathering in larger groups and showing signs of preparation for coordinated action. They were positioning themselves at key points around our property, and they were doing so with the kind of systematic approach that suggested they were preparing for a major assault on our defenses. More disturbing, we could see infected individuals carrying what appeared to be tools and makeshift weapons. They had apparently learned to use human artifacts to enhance their capabilities, which represented a fundamental evolution in their threat level. If they were capable of using tools effectively, then they could potentially overcome defensive measures that had been designed to stop opponents who relied only on physical strength and speed. The final trigger for our departure was the arrival of what appeared to be a leadership group among the infected. These individuals moved with more purpose and coordination than the others, and they seemed to be directing the positioning and activities of the larger group. When they began what looked like a systematic inspection of our property's defenses, we realized that we were facing opponents who were capable of military-style planning and execution. We had perhaps 6 hours before the infected would be ready to launch their coordinated assault, and we needed to use that time to prepare for our escape and departure. Mark had identified a route that would take us through areas with lower infected populations, and he had selected a vehicle that could be quickly modified for better protection and extended range. Lisa had organized our supplies for rapid deployment, and she had prepared emergency packs for each family member that contained essential medications and survival equipment. Emma had been assigned the critical task of monitoring the infected activity through our security cameras, watching for changes in their deployment that might indicate they were ready to begin their assault. Her observations would determine the timing of our departure, because leaving too early would mean abandoning valuable preparation time, while leaving too late would mean trying to escape through an active attack. As I prepared my dental kit for what might be our final departure from my house, I reflected on how much had changed in just 3 days. My comfortable life as a cosmetic dentist seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the harsh realities of survival in a world where my precision training and medical knowledge had become essential tools for keeping my new family alive. The leather bag that had once contained routine dental supplies now held the medical resources that might determine whether we lived or died in the dangerous world beyond my walls. The infected outside were no longer just a threat to be avoided. They had become intelligent opponents who were capable of learning, planning, and coordinating complex activities. Our survival would depend on our ability to stay ahead of their evolving capabilities, while finding ways to build sustainable communities with other survivors who shared our commitment to preserving human civilization in this transformed world. Our escape from my house required precision timing that would have made my most complex dental procedures seem simple by comparison. Mark had identified a modified pickup truck 3 houses down that belonged to the Rodriguezes, a family that had apparently evacuated during the first wave of infections. The vehicle had a reinforced bed cover and heavy-duty suspension that could handle additional weight. Plus, Mark was confident he could hotwire it quickly once we reached the garage, where it was stored. The plan was deceptively straightforward, but it required each of us to execute our roles perfectly, while the infected were preparing their coordinated assault on my property. Lisa would carry baby Jake and an emergency medical kit I had prepared specifically for treating injuries during our escape. Emma would be responsible for a backup supply pack and would stay close to her mother throughout the operation. Mark would handle the vehicle modifications and navigation, despite still recovering from his infected bite wound. I would bring my complete dental kit plus additional medical supplies that might be essential for treating injuries in other survivor groups. What made the plan particularly dangerous was our realization that the infected had apparently learned to anticipate escape attempts. Emma's observations through our security cameras had revealed that they were positioning sentries along the most obvious escape routes, and they were doing so with the kind of strategic thinking that suggested they understood our options better than we would have liked. They weren't just waiting for us to emerge from our fortress. They were actively preparing to intercept us during any attempted departure. The timing window Emma had identified was narrow but critical. The infected leadership group conducted what appeared to be coordination meetings every few hours, during which the individual sentries would briefly abandon their positions to receive instructions or report their observations. We would have perhaps 15 minutes during one of these meetings to reach the Rodriguez garage, modify the truck for our needs, and begin our journey before the sentries returned to their positions. My biggest concern was baby Jake's condition during the escape. His fever had broken, but he was still weak from his recent illness, and the stress of a dangerous journey could easily trigger a relapse. I had prepared concentrated doses of infant medications that Lisa could administer quickly if needed, but treating a sick baby while fleeing from intelligent predators was not exactly an ideal medical scenario. The medications I was carrying represented nearly all of my remaining pediatric supplies, which meant that if Jake became seriously ill during our journey, we would have no resources for treating him. Mark's mechanical preparations had been thorough, but they also highlighted how much we were gambling on his expertise. He had identified the tools we would need to modify the truck's defenses, planned the route that would take us away from the most heavily infected areas, and even calculated our fuel requirements for reaching potential survivor communities. However, all of his planning was based on assumptions about vehicle performance and road conditions that we wouldn't be able to verify until we were already committed to the escape. The most sobering aspect of our departure planning was the recognition that we might be leaving other survivors behind. My neighborhood had been home to dozens of families before the outbreak, and while most appeared to have evacuated or been killed, there might still be people hiding in their homes and waiting for rescue. Our escape plan would take us away from any potential survivors in the immediate area, but stopping to search for them would dramatically increase our risk of being caught by the organized infected groups. Lisa had been the one to raise this ethical dilemma, pointing out that we had been rescued ourselves and had a responsibility to help others if possible. Her perspective was compelling, but it also forced us to confront the harsh realities of survival in a world where compassion could easily become a fatal weakness. We agreed that we would investigate any obvious signs of survivors along our escape route, but we wouldn't delay our departure or take significant risks to search systematically for people who might be hiding. Emma's final surveillance report before our departure revealed something that changed our entire understanding of the infected behavior we had been observing. The coordination meetings she had been monitoring weren't just tactical planning sessions. They appeared to be training exercises with experienced infected individuals teaching newer ones how to recognize and counter human survival strategies. The infected were not just learning from their own experiences. They were systematically sharing knowledge across their group and developing institutional memory that would make them increasingly dangerous over time. This discovery was terrifying because it suggested that the infected represented an evolving threat that would become more sophisticated with each encounter with human survivors. They weren't just hungry predators driven by instinct. They were intelligent opponents who were actively working to improve their effectiveness against human resistance. Any survival strategy that worked today might be completely ineffective tomorrow if the infected had time to observe it and develop countermeasures. The departure itself was more chaotic than our careful planning had anticipated. The infected leadership meeting began on schedule, and we could see most of the sentries moving toward their coordination area as expected. However, several infected individuals remained in positions that would allow them to observe our escape route, which meant we would have to deal with active opposition during our most vulnerable moments. Mark moved faster than I had expected, given his recent injuries, and he had the truck running within minutes of reaching the Rodriguez garage. The vehicle was larger and more robust than my BMW, which gave us better protection, but also made us more visible to any infected who might be watching for unusual activity. Lisa and Emma loaded their assigned supplies efficiently, but baby Jake chose that moment to begin crying, which created noise that could potentially attract attention from infected individuals who were supposed to be attending the coordination meeting. I had anticipated this possibility and had prepared a mild sedative that could quiet Jake quickly without causing harmful side effects. The medication worked within minutes, but administering it under pressure while preparing for a dangerous escape reminded me how much our survival depended on my medical knowledge and the supplies I had managed to preserve from my dental practice. Every medication I used brought us closer to the point where we would have no resources for treating future medical emergencies. The truck modifications Mark had planned were effective, but time-consuming. He reinforced the windows with metal mesh that would stop infected claws while still allowing us to see and shoot if necessary. He also modified the doors to lock from the inside in ways that would be difficult for infected attackers to overcome, even if they had learned to use simple tools. Most importantly, he installed additional fuel capacity that would extend our range and reduce our dependence on potentially dangerous supply stops. Our departure from the neighborhood was more eventful than we had hoped. 2 infected sentries had apparently remained at their post despite the coordination meeting, and they began pursuing us as soon as they saw the truck leaving the Rodriguez garage. Mark's modifications allowed us to outrun them easily, but their Immediate response suggested that they were in communication with the larger group, and that our escape had probably been reported to the infected leadership. This meant we would be facing pursuit rather than simply traveling through uncontrolled territory. The infected group surrounding my house now knew our vehicle, our approximate destination, and our capabilities. They might attempt to coordinate with other infected groups along our route, or they might mount a direct pursuit that could force us into dangerous confrontations before we reached potential safe areas. The radio communications we monitored during our escape provided fragmentary but encouraging information about other survivor groups. Several communities had apparently established sustainable defensive positions in areas outside the major metropolitan zones, and they were actively seeking contact with other survivors who might be able to contribute specialized skills to their communities. Medical knowledge was specifically mentioned as being in high demand, which suggested that my dental training might be valuable currency in whatever communities we might encounter. However, the radio reports also indicated that the infected were mounting increasingly sophisticated attacks on established survivor communities. Several groups that had successfully maintained their positions for weeks had been overrun by coordinated infected assaults that demonstrated tactical planning and effective use of improvised weapons. The infected were apparently learning to overcome static defenses through patience, observation, and systematic adaptation of their attack strategies. Our first supply stop was at a medical plaza similar to the one where I had originally planned to gather resources before meeting the Henderson family. The facility appeared to be abandoned, but Mark's mechanical expertise allowed him to identify signs that other survivors had visited the location recently. Fresh tire tracks, disturbed debris patterns, and evidence of systematic looting suggested that we might encounter other survivor groups in the area. The medical supplies we found exceeded my expectations. The facility had been only partially looted, apparently by people who didn't understand which medications and equipment would be most valuable in a post-collapse environment. I was able to replenish most of my essential medications, including antibiotics that would be crucial for treating infected wounds and pediatric supplies that might be needed for Jake's ongoing care. Most importantly, I found surgical instruments that were more appropriate for treating trauma injuries than the dental tools I had been carrying. Lisa discovered something equally valuable in the form of educational materials and children's books that could be used to continue Emma's education during our journey. Her teaching background had made her realize that maintaining some sense of normal childhood development would be essential for Emma's psychological health, and the books would provide structured activities that could occupy her attention during long periods of travel or hiding. Emma's contribution to our supply gathering was unexpected but proved to be crucial. Her smaller size allowed her to access storage areas that the adults couldn't reach, and she had an intuitive understanding of which medical supplies might be most useful based on her observations of my treatment procedures. She also demonstrated remarkable courage during our exploration of the facility, alerting us to potential dangers and helping to ensure that our supply gathering was completed efficiently. Mark's condition during our supply stop concerned me more than I had admitted to the rest of the group. His bite wound was healing well, and he showed no signs of infected transformation, but the physical exertion of our escape and the stress of our situation were taking a toll on his recovery. I administered additional antibiotics and pain medication, but I was beginning to worry that he might not have the stamina for an extended journey through dangerous territory. Our departure from the medical plaza was delayed by the discovery that we were not alone in the facility. We encountered another survivor group that consisted of 3 people: Dr. Sarah Chen, an emergency room physician who had been trapped in the medical plaza for several days; Tommy Martinez, a security guard, who had been protecting Dr. Chen since the outbreak began; and Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez, the facility's head pharmacist who had extensive knowledge of medication storage and distribution. Dr. Chen's medical expertise immediately complemented my dental knowledge, and she was able to provide treatments for Mark's condition that were more appropriate than anything I could offer. Her experience with trauma medicine and emergency procedures filled critical gaps in our group's medical capabilities, while my precision training and surgical skills provided resources that she had been lacking. The combination of our knowledge created a medical team that was far more capable than either of us would have been individually. Tommy's security background brought tactical expertise that none of us possessed, He had been observing infected behavior patterns from a different perspective than our group, and his insights into their operational methods provided valuable intelligence for planning our continued journey. He had also maintained radio contact with other survivor groups and had current information about safe routes in dangerous areas that could significantly improve our chances of reaching an established community. Mrs. Rodriguez's pharmaceutical knowledge was perhaps the most valuable addition to our group. She understood which medications would be most important for long-term survival, how to properly store and preserve medical supplies, and which treatments would be most effective for the kinds of injuries and illnesses we were likely to encounter. Her expertise transformed our random collection of medical supplies into a systematically organized medical capability that could serve a much larger survivor community. The decision to combine our groups was easy, but it also created new challenges. Our vehicle was already loaded to capacity with supplies and equipment, and adding 3 more people meant we would need to find alternative transportation or make difficult decisions about which supplies to abandon. Mark's mechanical skills were essential for solving this problem, as he was able to identify additional vehicles in the medical plaza parking area that could be modified for our expanded group. More importantly, our larger group had capabilities that opened up possibilities that hadn't been available to us as individual families. Dr. Chen's medical credentials and my dental expertise combined to create a medical team that would be highly valued by any survivor community. Tommy's security experience and Mark's mechanical knowledge provided tactical and logistical capabilities that could contribute to community defense and infrastructure development. Lisa's teaching skills and Mrs. Rodriguez's organizational experience offered resources for education and community management. However, our expanded group also represented a more visible target for infected attacks, and we had more people to protect if we encountered dangerous situations. Baby Jake's medical needs remained a concern, and adding 3 more adults meant we had more people who could potentially be injured or become ill during our journey. Our supply requirements had also increased dramatically, which meant we would need to take more risks to gather the resources necessary for our continued survival. The radio contact Tommy had maintained with other survivor groups provided our first real intelligence about the scope and organization of the emerging post-outbreak world. Several large communities had been established in rural areas with defensible geography, and they were actively recruiting survivors with specialized skills who could contribute to long-term sustainability. Medical professionals were particularly sought after, but communities also needed people with mechanical, educational, and organizational capabilities. What was most encouraging about these reports was the evidence that some survivor communities were succeeding in creating stable, growing populations that were beginning to develop sustainable food production, manufacturing capabilities, and even rudimentary government structures. The infected threat hadn't disappeared, but organized human resistance was proving capable of establishing secure territories and maintaining them against coordinated infected attacks. However, the radio communications also revealed that the infected were continuing to evolve their capabilities in response to human resistance. They had apparently learned to avoid direct confrontation with well-armed survivor communities, instead focusing on disrupting supply lines, isolating communities from each other, and mounting patient siege operations that could last for weeks or months. Some communities had been forced to abandon their positions, not because of direct attacks, but because the infected had successfully prevented them from accessing essential resources. Our journey toward the survivor communities Tommy had identified would take us through territory that was controlled by different infected groups, with varying levels of organization and tactical sophistication. We would need to adapt our strategies continuously as we encountered different threats, and we would need to balance speed against caution to avoid confrontations that could destroy our group before we reached safety. The medical supplies we had gathered would make us valuable to any community we encountered, but they also made us attractive targets for other survivor groups who might be willing to use violence to acquire resources they needed for their own survival. The post-outbreak world apparently included human threats as well as infected ones, and we would need to be prepared to defend ourselves against both types of opponents. As we prepared to leave the medical plaza and begin our journey toward the organized survivor communities, I reflected on how much our situation had changed in just 4 days. We had evolved from a trapped family into a capable medical and tactical team with the resources and knowledge needed to contribute meaningfully to the rebuilding of human civilization. The infected remained a serious threat, but we had proven that organized human resistance could not only survive their attacks, but could actually thrive and grow stronger. In response to the challenges they presented, our departure from the medical plaza marked the beginning of a new phase in our survival journey, one that would test all of our capabilities against threats we couldn't yet imagine. The infected had found us before we were ready to leave the medical plaza, and their approach was unlike anything we had encountered during our time barricaded in my house. Instead of the patient surveillance we had grown accustomed to, this group moved with military precision, surrounding the building in coordinated formations that blocked every possible escape route. Tommy's security experience immediately recognized the tactical sophistication of their deployment, and he grimly informed us that we were facing opponents who had learned to conduct siege operations with the efficiency of trained soldiers. Dr. Chen's medical expertise became crucial as we prepared for what appeared to be an extended standoff. She had identified critical supplies throughout the medical plaza that could be used to treat injuries during a potential battle, and she had established multiple aid stations in strategic locations throughout the building. Her emergency room experience had taught her to prepare for mass casualty situations, and she was applying that knowledge to our survival scenario with the kind of systematic efficiency that gave our group confidence even in the face of overwhelming odds. Mrs. Rodriguez had discovered something in the pharmacy records that changed our understanding of the infected behavior we had been observing. The medical plaza had been conducting experimental research on neurological medications that were designed to enhance cognitive function in patients with degenerative brain diseases. The research had been funded by the same government program that had developed the flu vaccine, and the timeline suggested that the infected cognitive abilities we had witnessed might be an unintended consequence of interactions between the vaccine and medications that had been widely distributed through the healthcare system. This discovery was both terrifying and hopeful. It explained why the infected were demonstrating intelligence and organizational capabilities that shouldn't have been possible for creatures driven purely by hunger and aggression. However, it also suggested that their enhanced abilities might be dependent on continued access to specific medications, which could potentially be disrupted if we could understand the biochemical mechanisms involved. Mark's mechanical skills had allowed him to identify structural weaknesses in the medical plaza that the infected might exploit during their assault, but he had also found ways to reinforce our defenses using equipment and materials available throughout the building. His ability to improvise solutions under pressure was proving invaluable, as he was able to create barriers and defensive positions that maximized our advantages, while minimizing the infected's ability to use their superior numbers effectively. Lisa's organizational abilities had become essential for coordinating our group's activities during the crisis. She had established communication protocols that allowed us to share information quickly and efficiently, and she had created supply distribution systems that ensured everyone had access to the equipment and medications they needed for their assigned roles. Her teaching background had given her experience managing complex group dynamics under pressure, and those skills were proving crucial for maintaining morale and focus during our most dangerous moments. Emma's observations of infected behavior patterns had revealed something that would determine our survival strategy. She had noticed that the infected surrounding the building were not maintaining static positions like the group that had besieged my house. Instead, they were conducting systematic reconnaissance missions with small teams exploring different sections of the building and reporting their findings to what appeared to be a command structure. This suggested that they were preparing for a coordinated assault rather than simply waiting for us to attempt an escape. Baby Jake's condition had stabilized since our departure from my house, but the stress of our situation was affecting him in ways that concerned me. He was sleeping more than normal, which could indicate either healthy recovery from his recent illness or a developing problem that I wasn't qualified to diagnose. Dr. Chen's pediatric knowledge was more extensive than mine, and she had assured me that Jake's symptoms were consistent with normal infant stress responses, but we were all aware that his medical needs could become critical if our situation deteriorated. Tommy's radio communications with other survivor groups had provided intelligence that would determine our tactical approach to the siege. The infected group surrounding us was apparently part of a larger coordinated operation that was targeting survivor groups throughout the region. Several other communities had reported similar attacks occurring simultaneously, which suggested that the infected were capable of strategic planning on a scale that exceeded anything we had previously imagined. More disturbing, the radio reports indicated that some of these coordinated attacks had been successful. Communities that had maintained secure positions for weeks had been overrun by infected groups that demonstrated tactical innovations specifically designed to counter their defensive strategies. The infected were not just learning from their own experiences. They were apparently sharing tactical knowledge across multiple groups and adapting their methods in real time based on the successes and failures of parallel operations. Our first major test came when the infected began probing our defenses with small-scale attacks designed to identify our capabilities and weaknesses. These probes were not the mindless, rushing attacks we might have expected from creatures driven purely by hunger. Instead, they were carefully planned reconnaissance missions that tested our response times, our weapons' effectiveness, and our coordination as a defensive team. Dr. Chen and I had established a medical station in the center of the building where we could treat injuries quickly while remaining protected from direct assault. Our combined medical expertise allowed us to handle trauma situations that would have been impossible for either of us to manage individually. My precision training complemented her emergency medicine experience, creating a medical capability that was far more effective than the sum of our individual skills. The infected's tactical sophistication became apparent during their first serious assault on our positions. Instead of attacking randomly, they coordinated simultaneous strikes on multiple entry points while using diversionary tactics to draw our attention away from their primary objectives. Their ability to execute complex battle plans demonstrated intelligence that challenged every assumption we had made about their cognitive capabilities. Mark's defensive preparations proved crucial during the assault. His reinforced barriers channeled the infected attacks into killing zones, where our limited weapons could be used most effectively, and his improvised alarm systems gave us advance warning when infected teams were preparing coordinated strikes. His mechanical knowledge had allowed him to create defensive advantages that multiplied our effectiveness against superior numbers. Tommy's security training became essential for coordinating our defensive efforts. He had established fields of fire that maximized our weapons' effectiveness while minimizing the risk of accidentally injuring each other, and he had created communication protocols that allowed us to respond quickly to changing tactical situations. His experience with crisis management provided the leadership structure our group needed to function effectively under extreme pressure. The siege lasted through most of the day, with the infected mounting increasingly sophisticated attacks while we adapted our defenses to counter their evolving tactics. Each assault taught them something about our capabilities, but we were also learning about their limitations and developing strategies that exploited their weaknesses. The battle became a deadly chess match, where both sides continuously adapted their approaches based on the successes and failures of previous moves. Our breakthrough came when Mrs. Rodriguez discovered that the infected's enhanced cognitive abilities were indeed dependent on regular access to specific medications. Her pharmaceutical knowledge had allowed her to identify compounds in the medical plaza's supply that could potentially disrupt the biochemical processes that were maintaining their intelligence. If we could introduce these compounds into their systems, we might be able to reduce them to the mindless creatures that conventional zombie mythology had predicted. The challenge was delivering the compounds effectively to infected attackers who were actively trying to kill us. Dr. Chen and I worked together to develop an aerosol delivery system using equipment from the Medical Plaza's respiratory therapy department. The system would allow us to create a chemical cloud that could affect multiple infected individuals simultaneously, potentially disrupting their coordination and reducing their tactical effectiveness. Mark's engineering skills were crucial for modifying the delivery system to work as a weapon rather than a medical device. He was able to create a dispersal mechanism that could be deployed quickly during an active assault, and he had identified strategic locations throughout the building where the aerosol could be most effective against attacking infected groups. The test of our chemical weapon came during the infected's most coordinated assault yet. They had apparently learned enough about our defenses to mount a simultaneous attack on all entry points while using diversionary tactics to prevent us from reinforcing threatened positions. Their tactical sophistication was overwhelming our defensive capabilities, and we were facing the possibility of being overrun despite our best efforts. The aerosol deployment was more effective than we had dared to hope. Infected individuals who were exposed to the chemical compound showed immediate signs of cognitive disruption, reverting to the kind of mindless behavior that made them much easier to defend against. Their coordinated tactics collapsed into random, individual attacks that our defensive positions could handle effectively. However, the chemical weapon also revealed something disturbing about the infected evolution. Some individuals appeared to be partially resistant to the compound's effects, maintaining enough cognitive function to recognize the threat and adapt their behavior accordingly. This suggested that the infected population was developing immunity to our countermeasures, which meant that any tactical advantage we gained would be temporary at best. Our escape from the medical plaza required timing and coordination that tested every skill our group had developed during the siege. The chemical weapon had disrupted the infected's immediate tactical capabilities, but we knew that their cognitive functions would eventually recover, and they would resume their coordinated assault with new strategies designed to counter our chemical defenses. Tommy had identified an escape route that would take us through areas where the infected presence was reduced due to the chemical dispersal, but the route required us to move quickly while carrying essential supplies and protecting our most vulnerable group members. Lisa's organizational skills were crucial for ensuring that everyone knew their role in the escape plan and had access to the equipment they would need during our movement. Dr. Chen and I had prepared medical kits that could handle the kinds of injuries we might sustain during a running battle, and we had established protocols for treating wounded group members while maintaining our movement toward safety. Our combined medical expertise had created capabilities that could keep our group functional, even if we encountered serious resistance during our escape. Mark had prepared our vehicles for rapid departure and had identified alternative routes that could be used if our primary escape plan was compromised. His mechanical knowledge had allowed him to enhance our transportation capabilities while ensuring that we could adapt quickly to changing tactical situations during our movement away from the medical plaza. The escape itself was more chaotic than our careful planning had anticipated, but our group's coordination and individual skills allowed us to overcome obstacles that would have been insurmountable for less prepared survivors. The infected's reduced cognitive abilities made them less effective at predicting our movements, but their numbers were still overwhelming, and we had to fight our way through several confrontations before reaching our vehicles. Emma's courage during the escape was remarkable. Despite being the youngest member of our group, she followed instructions perfectly and even provided crucial assistance during several critical moments when adult group members were occupied with immediate threats. Her presence reminded us that we were fighting not just for our own survival, but for the future of human civilization that she represented. Baby Jake's condition remained stable throughout the escape, thanks to the medical preparations Dr. Chen and I had made and Lisa's skill at protecting him during the most dangerous moments of our movement. His survival represented hope that families could endure even the most challenging circumstances if they had adequate medical support and group coordination. Our successful departure from the medical plaza marked a turning point in our survival journey. We had proven that organized human resistance could not only survive coordinated infected attacks, but could actually develop countermeasures that neutralized the infected's most dangerous capabilities. The chemical weapon we had developed represented a significant breakthrough in understanding how to combat the infected threat effectively. However, our victory also revealed the scope of the challenge we faced in rebuilding human civilization. The infected were evolving rapidly in response to human resistance, developing new capabilities and countermeasures that would require continuous innovation on our part. The post-outbreak world would be defined by an ongoing arms race between human ingenuity and infected adaptation. The radio communications we received during our escape provided encouraging news about the survivor communities we were trying to reach. Several groups had successfully established sustainable defensive positions and were actively recruiting survivors with specialized skills who could contribute to long-term community development. Our medical expertise, tactical knowledge, and technical capabilities would make us valuable additions to any community we encountered. Our arrival at the first major survivor community exceeded our expectations in every way. The settlement had been established in a former military facility that provided excellent defensive advantages, and the population included hundreds of survivors from diverse backgrounds who had pooled their skills and resources to create a functioning society. Medical professionals were indeed in high demand, and Dr. Chen and I were immediately recognized as valuable additions to the community's healthcare capabilities. Mark's mechanical skills and Tommy's security experience were equally valued, as the community needed people who could maintain essential infrastructure and provide tactical expertise for defending against infected attacks. Lisa's teaching background was crucial for the community's educational programs, and Mrs. Rodriguez's pharmaceutical knowledge was essential for managing the community's medical supply systems. Most importantly, the community had succeeded in creating an environment where children like Emma could grow up with some sense of normal childhood development despite the ongoing threats of the post-outbreak world. Educational programs, recreational activities, and social structures had been established that provided hope for the future of human civilization. Our integration into the community was smooth and rapid, thanks to the specialized skills we brought, and our proven ability to work effectively as a coordinated team. The medical facility we established combined Dr. Chen's emergency medicine expertise with my precision surgical training to create healthcare capabilities that exceeded what either of us could have provided individually. The chemical weapon technology we had developed at the medical plaza became a crucial component of the community's defensive strategies. Our research into infected cognitive enhancement provided insights that allowed the community to develop more effective countermeasures against coordinated infected attacks, and our tactical experience from the siege helped improve the community's overall defensive capabilities. Perhaps most significantly, our successful journey to the community demonstrated that survivor groups could travel safely through infected territory if they had adequate medical support, tactical, coordination, and technical capabilities. This encouraged other isolated survivors to attempt the journey to established communities, leading to steady population growth and increased diversity of skills within the surviving human population. The infected threat had not disappeared, but organized human resistance was proving capable of not just surviving, but actually thriving in the post-outbreak world. Communities were developing sustainable food production, manufacturing capabilities, and even technological innovation that promised to restore many aspects of pre-outbreak civilization. Baby Jake's recovery symbolized the hope that families could endure, and children could grow up healthy even in the most challenging circumstances. His survival represented the possibility that human civilization would not just persist, but would actually become stronger and more resilient as a result of the challenges it had faced. Our story had begun with a cosmetic dentist trapped in his office during the first moments of an outbreak that seemed likely to end human civilization. It had evolved into the story of a medical team that had developed innovative countermeasures against an evolving threat and had successfully established themselves as valuable contributors to a growing survivor community. The precision training that had once seemed relevant only to cosmetic dental procedures had proven essential for surgical techniques that saved lives during medical emergencies. The steady hands that had once focused on creating perfect smiles had become crucial for treating trauma injuries and developing chemical weapons that could neutralize intelligent opponents. In a world where a simple toothache could become life-threatening without proper medical care, the skills I had developed as a dentist had indeed proven far from shallow. They had become essential tools for preserving human life and rebuilding civilization in a transformed world where every specialized skill contributed to our collective survival and future prosperity.